Ben is going to speak for us today about the Bible and slavery. Super keen. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Greetings everyone, thanks for coming along. Today we'll be hearing a talk about the Bible and slavery. There are a few questions for consideration. How do we understand what the Bible says about slavery? How does that fit into the context of the ancient world? And then how do we understand slavery throughout the history of the church, particularly the Atlantic slave trade in the around the 19th century? Which is an important topic, as one of the main ethical objections against the Bible are that it seemingly permits or sanctions slavery, particularly relating to the use of the Bible during the Atlantic slave trade to justify the practice. So I'll be discussing how slavery was viewed at different times throughout the Bible. The Hebrew Bible and the New Testament both contain examples of God redeeming his people from slavery. Redemption means to purchase the freedom of someone or something at a cost, which is generally from slavery. This experience of being freed from slavery then shaped the new community's treatment of slaves. So across the Bible we see a move away from slavery and exploitative practices toward a community based on justice that recognises the dignity of human beings. And where slavery was permitted, it was only meant to be temporary and came with restrictions to preserve the well-being of the slave. So that's what I'm aiming to show in my talk. So to start with, we'll be looking at the patriarchal households pre-Israel, namely the households of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob and Joseph. And note, the words slaves and servants are generally used interchangeably, so there's not too much difference between them. By this time, the slave trade was permeating the ancient Near East. Joseph's brothers, for example, sold him to Midianite merchants for 20 shekels of silver. Joseph's other brothers, Simeon and Levi, also enslaved the women and children of the city of Shechem in Canaan. They later received a rebuke from their father Jacob for their cruelty and violence, indicating that that sort of slavery based on unjust violence should not be condoned. Slaves could be born into the household or bought with money. They could also be captured in warfare and made into servants, because being a servant was the price of their life. In a dangerous and wild time as it was, many people sought to join a tribe with a strong leader that was able to provide for them. They exchanged obedience and servitude in exchange for protection and provisions. The duties of these servants included cooking, tending to animals, fighting against enemy tribes, and other activities typical of a semi-nomadic lifestyle. The wife of the patriarch and other notable women also had personal maidservants to attend to their personal needs. Having many manservants and maidservants was a sign that God was blessing them. Jacob, for example, crossed the servant with its wooden staff and returned years later with 2 camps worth of servants and animals. A prosperous man could have hundreds of people following his household. The servants were not oppressed or barred from receiving the blessings of the household. Indeed, that the blessings that God gave to the patriarch were meant to flow onto others, including the servants. Through the patriarchs, God blessed households, the nation of Egypt, and promised to bless the world. Notably, Joseph himself was a slave when God used him to bless Egypt and others. So the blessings included material wealth, but also the opportunity to join into the worship of God as the one true God. One scholar, Goldwin Smith, described the patriarchal master-servant relation as, quote, morally beautiful, a picture of simple manners, of fidelity, mutual trust and love. So it's quite a remarkable thing to say about slavery. By the time we get to the book of Exodus, we see the story of the redemption follows this outline, which I think is useful to compare the Exodus and the cross redemptions, because they're both quite similar. So the time we get to Exodus, we encounter a very different type of slavery to the household-based slavery. We see the Israelites enslaved and oppressed by the Egyptians in a form of national slavery. And the book of Exodus is the story of God freeing the Israelites collectively from their slavery in Egypt. So we see the Exodus story follows the following structure. We have bondage, anticipation, calling, remembrance, deliverance, worship, and witness. With bondage, they were subjugated and enslaved by the Pharaoh. They were forced to work under slave masters in increasingly brutal conditions, particularly on industrial projects. Their lives were hard, and they were denied any chance to worship the Hebrew God in the desert. Anticipation, they yearned for freedom from their burdens in Egypt, and many wondered where the God of their forefathers was. God, hearing their cries and having compassion of them, remembered his covenant promises, it says. So then, in calling, God calls Moses to be his prophet to, quote, bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Moses was chosen to speak to the Pharaoh and lead the Hebrew people from slavery to freedom. With remembrance, on the eve of their departure, the Hebrews were instructed to kill a lamb and cover their doorframes with blood. They then ate the lamb with bitter herbs and bread made without yeast. This was named the Lord's Passover because the Lord passed over the Hebrew homes and spared their firstborn. The meal was eaten every year after that in remembrance of their redemption from Egypt. In deliverance, through mighty acts of judgment against the Egyptians and Pharaoh's army, including the 10 plagues, God brought his people out of Egypt, and thereafter he provided his people with water and manna and quail until their journey into the promised land. Worship. Their relationship with God was central to Israel's purpose and identity. As God said, I will take you as my people and I will be your God. Notably, the impetus for the plagues in the beginning was that they were denied permission to make sacrifices in the desert by the Pharaoh. When they escaped Egypt, Moses led the Israelites in a song of worship, while Miriam led the women with tambourines, dancing and singing. And also, a priesthood was created to tend to the temple, make sacrifices and represent God to the people. Witness. The Israelites were called to be a priestly kingdom and a holy nation, as an example to the surrounding nations. The Israelites were called to bear witness to the God who had brought them out of Egypt. There's quite a global vision in a prophecy from Zechariah. Quote, in those days 10 men from all languages and nations will take firm hold of one Jew by the hem of his robe and say, let us go with you, because we have heard that God is with you. So that's what they were trying to do. They were trying to be an example for the surrounding nations. The Exodus was a formative experience for the people of Israel. It was meant to radically change how they related to each other, particularly their slaves, as they'd once been slaves themselves. Israelites were called to live according to the law set by God, which begins, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. While slavery was allowed, the Israelites were called to live as a redeemed people, as liberated slaves, remembering their experience as slaves and the freedom that God gave them. Hence, the nature of slavery was to be extraordinarily different from the surrounding nations, particularly Egypt, where they had been slaves themselves. So the Mosaic Law aimed at three things relating to slavery: prevention, humane treatment, and freedom. Prevention was aimed at limiting the amount of people entering slavery or being forced into slavery. The law provided a basis for a socially and economically just society. Provisions were given to the poor, the marginalised and foreigners so that they would not be exploited or pressured into slavery. As the Lord had richly blessed Israel, they were to provide for the poor people among them. When the Israelites entered Canaan, the land was divided between the families into 12 tribes. There's a very long and boring section in Joshua detailing who gets what. Supposing that this distribution was carried out fairly, most families would have enough land to support themselves and their families. Even if the families sold their land, it would be returned to them every 50 years on the year of Jubilee. Thus, a family would not permanently lose a source of food and income. Furthermore, if someone had a bad harvest or needed money, they could ask their neighbours for interest-free loans. Any outstanding loans would be forgiven every 7 years so that people would not be bound by debt, which was one of the major reasons why people fell into slavery and poverty in the ancient world. The prophet Elisha, for example, encountered a widow whose 2 sons were about to be enslaved by her creditors. Elisha miraculously provided oil to pay off her debt, which shows the law itself then wasn't being followed because the debt should have been forgiven anyway. Anyone who did not have land of their own could still share in the harvest. They could eat as much grapes or corn as they could eat on the spot, which is known as gleaning. Indeed, landowners were called to purposely leave food from the poor and alien by not reaping to the edges of the field and not going over the crops a second time. And you see there's a picture of Ruth in the book of Ruth, who is one of the people who takes advantage of the law. Also, it was forbidden to forcibly enslave Hebrews, as anyone, quote, anyone who kidnaps or either sells him or still has him when he is caught must be put to death, which is quite an extreme punishment for a slave trade. Hebrews could only be made slaves voluntarily by putting themselves into slavery. Naturally, the ideals set out in these laws were not always followed in practice. Around 440 BC, the prophet Nehemiah noticed many Israelites were being forced to sell themselves or their children into slavery because of usurious loans from their fellow Israelites. He demanded they be returned all their fields and vineyards so they could support themselves. So even though the law was not always being followed by the people, God did send prophets to remind the people what they were meant to do and to care for the oppressed in society. Secondly, there's fair treatment. Israel was not to be another land of slavery as Egypt was. So rather than exploiting or subjugating their bonded servants or slaves, masters were called to treat them kindly as fellow Hebrews. In their relationships with foreigners, including foreign slaves, the Israelites were to remember that they were once aliens in Egypt themselves and should act with empathy and kindness. For example, the Sabbath day, was the day of rest for everyone, including the servants. Working as a bonded servant or slave provided a person with food and shelter. For people in dire poverty, working as a slave was an alternative to being destitute and starving. So while slavery is often dehumanising and exploitative, it can be beneficial in limited circumstances. Goldwin Smith noted that in the master-slave relationship, the power is intended for the benefit of both parties and is therefore carefully guarded and restricted so as to secure that benefit. So a servant working in a wealthy household received food and shelter, while the master had good labour. And if the law was followed, the slaves would be treated much the same as free servants and had reasonably good conditions. Indeed, slaves who liked their master and liked how they were going in the household could remain in the household of life, and this would be confirmed by the judge, and they would be the ear would be pierced with an awl, as seen in the picture there, to signify the decision. Of course, not everyone wanted to stay in the household forever. Legally, the servitude of a Hebrew slave was only temporary. A Hebrew slave was freed in the 7th year of their servitude, and also every 50 years all slaves would be freed. The master should be generous at this time and, quote, supply him liberally from the flock, the threshing floor, and the winepress, as seen in Deuteronomy. As God freed the Israelites from slavery in Egypt and blessed them, the Israelites were called to free and bless their slaves. If the law was followed, this would ensure continual manumission and prevent slavery from becoming entrenched in society, becoming a slave society. Walsh writes, laws like this were rooted in Israel's memory of God. Because God releases slaves out of Egyptian bondage, so Israel is called to image God by being a slave-releasing community. The prophet Jeremiah reminded the people of Israel of this law later on when masters were refusing to free their slaves. So he said, you must free the slaves. And when they did free the slaves and they took them back, and Jeremiah was like, well, something bad's going to happen to you. So these provisions were aimed at preventing people from being forced into slavery, to prevent abuse and exploitation of those in slavery, and to ensure that people were regularly free. Where the law was being neglected, as it was, often the prophets spoke up for justice and helped the people. So we move on to the New Testament, where we can see there's another redemption experience of the cross. The cross mirrors and indeed fulfills the Exodus redemption. It follows the same broad outline that we've looked at before. So with bondage, the Jews had gained their independence from the Seleucid Empire in the 2nd century BC, and then this was lost again to the Romans in 63 BC. The Jews chafed under foreign subjugation, and they wanted a Messiah to free them from this. However, the true issue the New Testament identifies is not their material slavery or subjugation, but their slavery to sin, which is a personal and spiritual bondage that separates people from God. This anticipation for the Messiah to come. Imagine the excitement people had when they saw Jesus and wondered, could this be the Christ, the Messiah? Many people were hoping for a Messiah, as I said, who would liberate them from Roman rule. However, Jesus declined to become a military king as he came to redeem people from their slavery to sin, not Roman rule. On the eve of his death, Jesus shared the Passover meal with his disciples in memory of the Exodus. So you can see already there's a link between the two redemption experiences. Jesus redefines the meal in terms of himself and creates a new tradition of remembrance for his followers that we still celebrate today. Jesus himself assumes the role of the paschal lamb that was sacrificed during the Exodus and becomes the ultimate sacrifice by dying on the cross for the redemption of humanity. Calling in the Garden of Gethsemane. Jesus knew throughout his ministry that he would suffer and die as a Messiah. In the Garden of Gethsemane, this comes to a head. His anguish is so intense that his sweat was like drops of blood, but nonetheless he submits himself to the plan. Deliverance. Jesus then suffers and dies on the cross as, quote, a ransom to set them, God's people, free from the sins committed under the first covenant. That's in Hebrews. Through Jesus' blood and death, we are freed from lives in slavery and separation from God to becoming part of God's household. Paul writes that God, quote, has rescued us from the dominion of darkness and brought us into the kingdom of the Son who he loves, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins, in Colossians. So this language marks the cross as an Exodus-like event, the final liberation from slavery to freedom. And with worship, Christians in the early church worshipped together with psalms, hymns and songs, and to make music from the heart to the Lord. That's in Ephesians. Whereas before only the Levites could become priests, all Christians are now, quote, chosen by God to be part of the holy priesthood, 1 Peter. So just as the nation of Israel had been called to witness to the nations, the Church of God too has a missional mandate. Jesus commissioned the disciples to, quote, go and make disciples of all nations, where repentance and forgiveness of sins will be preached in his name. Christians are called to be witnesses of Jesus, spreading the good news about who he is and what he achieved to the world. So how does this experience shape how the church responded to Roman slavery in the context of the Roman Empire, which they found themselves? As with Israel and the Exodus experience, the cross fundamentally shaped how the new community of the early church understood slavery. So as this church spread, naturally both slaves and masters were converted and became part of the church. Paul says that slaves are called to serve their masters wholeheartedly as a way of witnessing to them through hard work if they're a non-believing master. If they have a Christian master, they have an opportunity to serve their master as a brother in Christ. If they have a harsh master who beats them or mistreats them, they are commended for witnessing even in the face of their suffering. So being a slave is not a good thing or in itself, but that's the position they're in to witness from, and they have a greater hope that even greater than being freed materially is the spiritual freedom that they already have. Christian masters in turn are called to treat their slaves in the same way by being fair and just. Both slaves and masters are equal under a God who has, quote, no favoritism between master and servant. Slaves and masters are equal under God, as the slave is called the Lord's free man, and the master is Christ's slave. The Greek satirist Lucian of Samosata said, it was impressed on them by the original lawgiver that they are all brothers from the moment they are converted. That's a comment on the early church from an outside perspective. When the Apostle Paul encounters a runaway slave called Onesimus, who ran away from his master Philemon, and by this time they're both Christians. Paul returns the slave to his master, but says the relationship between them has been transformed, quote, on the basis of love in Philemon. He is returned, quote, no longer as a slave, but better than a slave, as a dear brother. Philemon and other masters have themselves been freed from slavery to sin through Jesus. Hence they called us to treat their slaves with kindness and compassion. By altering the dynamic between master and slave, the institution of slavery is radically changed. The slave is no longer subjected because he obeys the master freely in Christian love and service, and the master no longer exploits him. Goldwin Smith says, Christ found barbarous institutions, and he undermined and fully destroyed them by entering the heart and conscience of the individual. Some may say Paul is entrenching or sanctioning slavery, or saying slavery is a good thing, potentially. To the contrary, Paul says merchant slave traders are, quote, lawbreakers and rebels against God, among other people. The book of Revelation further pronounces woe on the merchants of Babylon, referring to Rome, who trade in the bodies of souls and men. So naturally, if people weren't capturing and trading slaves, which is forbidden, which is condemned under the New Testament, the system of slavery would pass away within a generation. Moreover, what were the alternatives to saying you should obey your masters? Slaves could run away or fight a violent uprising against the established order, but either one would lead to harsh reprisals from the Roman state. The Romans had already crushed several slave revolts in the past, e.g. Spartacus. Had Paul told slaves to be disobedient or rebellious, this would have painted Christians as troublemakers and lawbreakers, rather than people living out of self-sacrificial service and love. Christians as a minority did not have the power to overturn the system, but they could live out an alternative lifestyle and community, which they did. So what was slavery like in the Roman world as a comparison? It was heavily entrenched in the Roman economic and social fabric. Many slaves worked in a variety of occupations. Many of them had miserable conditions in large farming estates or in the mines, just being exploited for profit. Their treatment and whether they'll eventually be freed was up to the whims of the particular master. On the other hand, some people did sell themselves into slavery voluntarily, particularly the poor, because it was a means of financial advancement, as a skilled slave was highly valued and treated well. And if you were in a wealthy household, potentially you could gain the favour of the master and move up in life. Rome had an open model of slavery, meaning slaves were integrated into the broader society upon being freed. Manumission was fairly frequent for domestic and skilled slaves, as masters liked to have many freedmen and free women, because having a retinue of free people around them was even better than having a retinue of slaves. By contrast, something like the Atlantic, the US slavery was a closed system, so slaves had if you were a slave, that was your status forever, really. It's quite interesting to look at the language of the New Testament used in the context of the Roman Empire and what the slavery was like there. In Roman society, freed slaves could not themselves be citizens, though if you were freed, your children could be made a citizen. In the New Testament, however, all Christians having been freed from slavery have citizenship in heaven. Freedmen and women generally remained in the household of their masters. They were under the patronage of the master, who still cared for them, but they remained below the master's children, notably. But through the cross, Christians are not merely freed, but have a, quote, adoption to sonship. We become children of God, and by extension, quote, heirs of God and co-heirs of Christ. Whereas a Roman master might give a favoured slave freedom or some gifts, all Christians are being elevated to being an heir of the household and the future inheritance on a level akin to Christ himself, which is an extraordinary promise and demonstrates the grace of God that he gives to people who he's freed from slavery. So we move on to the Atlantic slave trade, controversial example of the Bible being used to sanction or justify slavery, but also to support the abolitionist movement. The Atlantic slave trade over a few centuries was a mass involuntary movement of some 12 million people from Africa to the Americas and to work on plantations, mines, other industrial projects, among other things. So it's worth asking the question, why was it practiced and accepted by ostensibly Christian nations and was it indeed sanctioned by the Bible? So the Bible was used notably to legitimise the slave trade, and what happened there. The Southerners believed that slavery was, quote, sanctioned by the Old Testament and permitted by the New. One of the passages used was in Genesis. It's Noah's curse upon his son. Quote, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants shall he be unto his brethren," which for some reason was taken as a curse for his descendants. And then the slavery proponents claimed that Africans were his descendants, so they deserved to be slaves, which is it's hard to justify genealogically. I don't think you can really go over thousands of years like that they were defend. So that's quite easily discounted. Another one, the main one, probably harder to explain away. This passage in Leviticus, it says, quote, "Foreign slaves, you can bequeath them to their children as inherited property and make them slaves for life." So whereas Hebrew slaves were freed, foreign slaves could be kept in the household as slaves. And proponents of slavery argue that if Israelites could capture and enslave foreign peoples, the Europeans were permitted to do so as well. However, the problem with this argument, or a way to discount it, is that biblical slavery was always part of an arc leading to greater justice and freedom and away from slavery. And notably, the Israelites were called to share the blessings of foreigners, including foreign members of the household, rather than exploit them. Moreover, after the cross redemption, there is no longer any distinction between foreigner and slave, foreigner and Israelite, or any other ethnic distinction. Paul writes, "There's no difference between Greeks, Jews, barbarians, or Scythians, but Christ is all and in all." So there's really no justification biblically for Europeans to enslave Africans on ethnic grounds. Goldwin Smith, writing in the midst of the American Civil War, says, "The Mosaic laws did not encourage even the qualified slavery which they permitted. The Mosaic laws applied to the state of Israel at the time and did not provide any imperative or permission for slavery at a later time." And if we extrapolate from Paul's comments that slave traders were lawbreakers and rebels against God, it's hard to really justify the practice of slave trading in any circumstance, really. Which makes it quite... I'm not sure why Christians assumed that it was all right for them to do that. And indeed, even if we accept slavery at a later time, the biblical slavery was much different to the American slavery that they took up. In Israelite society, slavery was meant to be a mutually beneficial contract between the servant and the landlord, whereas the Atlantic slave trade involved mass trafficking and exploitation of people to make profit. The conditions were abhorrent. There was little opportunity for freedom and advancement, and the most likely outcome would be to die on the voyage or to die on the plantation after like a horrible life. So, the question, perhaps a greater question to ask is not why is there slavery in a certain society, but why, as slavery occurs in nearly every civilization and society, but the question is, why did slavery come to an end? In the West, the reason was for the Christian-inspired abolitionist movement that saw slavery as incompatible with biblical teaching. So they used biblical teaching to say that slavery is wrong, should be ended. This included William Wilberforce, and John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace, also joined the abolitionist movement later on, having once been a slave trader himself. So the Bible does permit slavery in Israel in the early church under limited conditions. But the experience of being freed, being redeemed from slavery, was meant to radically change the attitude they have towards their slaves. Particularly in the New Testament, treating each other as brothers in Christ really undermined the institution of slavery, as people would treat each other as brothers in Christ, not as master and slave. So the slavery dynamic really doesn't really have any more power over them. Yeah, in the eyes of God, it says there's no difference between master and slave, or between the native and the foreigner, but all are equal. Hence, there is no justification for one group or people subjugating or exploiting another group, whether in biblical times or later on. Moreover, the blessings that people received were meant to flow over into blessings for others. The Israelites are given freedom of land, which they were meant to share with each other and with foreigners. We can see that God cares about weaker members of societies, including the poor, the foreigners and slaves. Hence the Mosaic laws aimed for a society that was based on economic justice and fairness and ensured that everyone had enough to live on. The members of the early church also were called to live generously and self-sacrificially as they did, sharing their resources between them so that they could help others in need. If we come to the modern day, in Australia, as university students, we have many blessings and resources of our own, which we are called, if we follow the biblical example, to help others with, to share our blessings with others. For example, according to some estimates, there are more slaves in the modern world than any other time in history, which is quite extraordinary. Estimates range from between 21 to 46 million people are still slaves, whether in sexual trafficking, forced labour, other forms of sweatshops, other forms of slavery. In comparison, there's only about 5 million slaves at any time in the Roman Empire, and the Atlantic slave trade involved 12 million people in total. It's easy to ignore the issue because it's not really at the forefront of our mind. It's quite far down the supply chain in a foreign country. But if you take the biblical call for freedom, economic justice seriously, I think we should be cognizant about the issue, sort of support the call for freedom for all people in the world. Further reading, Goldwyn Smith, really good source. I've quoted him a few times. He written in the American Civil War. Carolyn Shanks also writes about the Atlantic slave trade. There are a couple of things I've written myself, quite interesting. And that is the talk. So if you have any questions, I'm happy to discuss them. Yep.
I kind of missed the start, so I'm not sure if you explained it. What's manumission?
Manumission is when you're freeing a slave. So, yeah. Yeah.
Do you know of, or have you looked into much about ways of combating modern slavery?
I think there's supporting fair trade products. Baptist World Aid also has ethical shopping booklets for electronic equipment and clothing, I think. So they rate companies according to how ethical their supply chains are. So that's important from a consumer perspective, I think.
There's also a thing called the ping pong fund.
Yeah.
It's to raise money for people who are fighting in slavery.
Okay. Anyway, we have some time for discussion. So, what do you think of the biblical passages on slavery? Do you think biblical authors should have spoken more strongly against slavery? Can slavery be legitimate? How should we respond to Christians perpetrating slavery throughout history? What do we do about slavery in the modern world? And is it a good idea to buy slaves to gain their freedom? It's an ethical question, quite interesting. So if you want to break up into groups, discuss these questions, we have about 15 minutes left, I think.